Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
All right, John, it is your turn. Tell us about your story.
So, I don't know, it's been like a year or more than a year since we did Jorge Luis Borges. We did The Library of Babel. And in that episode, I was like, oh, there's so many good stories in this book. I want to do Borges stories for the next 6 months and that's it. And then I haven't gone back and I was like, I gotta get back. I gotta go do one of those. So I picked The Garden of Forking Paths, which is, I was like, I'm gonna look on these lists and decide and figure out which one is kind of determined to be his best story or whatever. And I don't know if this is actually his best story, but it was on a bunch of lists as number one, so that's why I picked it.
You got a section to read for us?
So there's a section, see if I can find it, but it's where he first starts talking to that guy when he gets to the house. Yeah, it starts with, oh, and I might have a slightly different translation.
Okay.
Because I have it in a book, this book, Labyrinths.
Right.
But it starts, but from the rear of the secluded house within a lantern. That's right. One of the reasons I made myself start reading here is because that weird sentence. From the rear of the secluded house within, a lantern approached.
Mine says, but from the end of the avenue from the main house, a lantern approached. That's a lot
Wild.
different.
That's
Yeah.
pretty different.
Okay, let's see how it goes. It might just be the beginning there.
But from the rear of the secluded house within, a lantern approached. A lantern that the trees sometimes striped and sometimes eclipsed. A paper lantern that had the form of a drum and the color of the moon. A tall man bore it. I didn't see his face, for the light blinded me. He opened the door and said slowly, in my own language, I see that the pious Shi Peng persists in correcting my solitude. You no doubt wish to see the garden? I recognized the name of one of our consuls, and I replied, disconcerted, the garden? The Garden of Forking Paths. Something stirred in my memory, and I uttered with incomprehensible certainty, the garden of my ancestor, Shui Pen. Your ancestor? Your illustrious ancestor? Come in. The damp path zigzagged like those of my childhood. We came to a library of Eastern and Western books. I recognized bound in yellow silk several volumes of the Lost Encyclopedia, edited by the third emperor of the Luminous dynasty, but never printed. The record on the phonograph revolved next to a bronze phoenix. I also recall a famille rose vase and another, many centuries older, of that shade of blue, which our craftsmen copied from the potters of Persia. Stephen Albert observed me with a smile. He was, as I have said, very tall, sharp-featured, with gray eyes and a gray beard. There was something of a priest about him, and also of a sailor. Later he told me that he had been a missionary in Tientsin before aspiring to become a sinologist. We sat down, I on a long, low divan, he with his back to the window and a tall circular clock. I calculated that my pursuer, Richard Madden, could not arrive for at least an hour. My irrevocable determination could wait. An astounding fate, that of Cui Pen, Stephen Albert said, governor of his native province, learned in astronomy, in astrology, and in the tireless interpretation of the canonical books. Chess player, famous poet, and calligrapher, he abandoned all this in order to compose a book and a maze. He renounced the pleasures of both tyranny and justice, of his populous couch, of his banquets, and even of erudition, all to close himself up for 13 years in the pavilion of the limpid solitude. When he died, his heirs found nothing save chaotic manuscripts. His family, as you may be aware, wished to condemn them to the fire, but his executor, a Taoist of Buddhist monk, insisted on their publication. We descendants of Cui Pen, I replied, continue to curse that monk. Their publication was senseless. The book is an indeterminate heap of contradictory drafts. I examined it once. In the third chapter, the hero dies. In the fourth, he is alive. As for the other undertakings of Cui Pen, his labyrinth, here is Cui Pen's labyrinth, he said, indicating a tall lacquered desk. An ivory labyrinth? I exclaimed. A tiny labyrinth? A labyrinth of symbols, he corrected. An invisible labyrinth of time. To me, our barbarous Englishman, has been entrusted the revelation of this diaphanous mystery. After more than 100 years, the details are irretrievable, but it is not hard to conjecture what happened. Cui Pen must have said once, I am withdrawing to write a book, and another time, I am withdrawing to construct a labyrinth. Everyone imagined two works. To no one did it occur that the book and the maze were one and the same thing. The pavilion of the limpid solitude stood in the center of a garden that was perhaps intricate. That circumstance may have suggested to men a physical labyrinth. Cui Pen died. No one in the vast territories that were his came upon the labyrinth. The confusion of the novel suggested to to me that it was the maze. Two circumstances gave me the correct solution of the problem. One, a curious legend that Sui Pen had planned to create a labyrinth which would be strictly infinite. The other, a fragment of a letter I discovered.
What did you think of this one? I know you said like you didn't know that maybe this would or wouldn't be one of his best. It certainly feels as big an undertaking as the other one we read.
Yeah, I mean, Borges has that. In the last episode, when we talked about the Library of Babel, I tried to dub it philosophical fiction. He's doing philosophy at the same time he's writing fiction in some way. The Library of Babel was in kind of contemplation of infinity, and this one is a contemplation of, I don't know, alternate timelines and the nature of choice and stuff. There's a lot you could build into it, but then it's wrapped up in like that thing where they talk about this novel that was the thing is wrapped in this overstory about how the spy needs to get a message to Germany so they know where to bomb. And the way he figures out how to do that is by murdering somebody with the same name as the city they want to, where the target is, so that it would get in the newspaper and then they could discover that. I don't know how those connect. There are ways that the text makes them connect, but I was left with like, how do these go together?
Yeah.
It's still a fun read, and I enjoyed reading it. I liked it. I liked the story. But when you think about it, like everything I read or I see or read about this story, they always talk about, oh, the Garden of the Forking Paths, and it's an interesting thing about multiple realities, like the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum physics is brought up as being inspired by this or somehow attached to this story. How every choice like forks you into a new reality, new set of possible realities, and like, oh, they all exist simultaneously somehow. But that's just like one tiny section of the story. Nobody talks about this overarching story about a spy who was trying to get a message out. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really think about that too hard because I guess I thought that like the whole kind of point was that there's also maybe a timeline where the spy knocks, Albert answers the door and he shoots him on sight. And then there's a version like this where he gets to understand like what a lucky choice it was to have stumbled upon this Albert and then to get this backstory and to have like this lesson told to him by the only guy that could tell him, you know, that like in another world we would be friends. In another timeline and space, you would not be using me to send a message. And instead we would be sharing these details about your ancestor who wrote this book and built this labyrinth, and we'd like have equal admiration for it. And because you have to come and do this horrible thing to me, at least I can like tell you that it's not all bad, that there's other scenarios where you don't do bad things to me.
Well, he doesn't know that he's going to kill him, but there is a specific point when he actually says to him, in another reality, we would be enemies.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't know. But like it's I guess the point being that like he has to do this horrible, terrible thing. And at the end he's like, you know, nobody, at least in my version, it says the last sentence for mine says he knew that my problem was to shout with my feeble voice above the tumult of war the name of the city called Albert, and that I had no other course open to me than to kill someone of that name. He does not know, for no one can, of my infinite penitence and sickness of the heart. And so like this might be a story, like a interesting little spy novel piece where it's cool how he decides to do this, and we maybe would be in on the decision as it happened, like gotta find an Albert, and the story would be like going door to door or something. And instead it's like he goes
Looked up in the
straight to an
phone book.
Albert. Yeah, and he happens upon the only Albert in the entire scenario, in the entire world, that could let him in on this universal secret, which is that he's doing a bad thing to this man in this version, but in other versions he's a good guy and he never does something bad. And I don't know, like it's the only like reconciliation he could probably get in this scenario. If he had stumbled upon a random Albert that didn't know anything about this, he would just feel terrible. And he wouldn't know that in another version of this story they could have been friends or are. I don't
Yeah.
know. I like stories like this though that play with all of the ideas of how time happens and scenarios play out.
There are a lot of those different like elements of the multiple forking paths kind of play into the overarching story. Like in the beginning, he says by the end of the day I'd be dead, but he didn't. He survived and he like had this other thing.
Yes.
Other stuff happened. The whole ending part where he said Madden showed up, he could see him coming across the thing.
Yeah.
But you come to realize that that doesn't seem to have actually happened. He doesn't seem to have actually been captured. Or if he did, he wasn't put to death. Madden wasn't
No.
just going killing everybody. So there's a lot of like kind of moments where you're like he is on a path that is adjacent to all these other paths in some way. And he's kind of like, whether it's some sort of manic delusion that he's having, that he thinks other things are going to happen or have happened, or if it's just glimpses into these alternate possibilities, we don't know. But kind of that murkiness of not knowing is plays into that central forking paths idea too.
Yeah, I feel like I have encountered stories like this, and I can't think of like an actual short story that we've read, but maybe like a Black Mirror Netflix episode or a movie or whatever, like where people like to envision all the scenarios in life and the idea that they're playing out somewhere in the universe.
Yeah.
And they're almost always a source of comfort because people don't fixate on the one that you mentioned, where this Albert articulates that, yes, and in another we're enemies. Nobody ever reminds themselves of that. They always remind themselves of the version where, like, well, in one scenario, we don't break up. We get married and we have kids and we stay happy. And in another scenario, my mother doesn't die of cancer when I'm 5.
Yeah.
And in another scenario, like, I get the job and I become the famous XYZ. I like that that's kind of the attitude about it, though. What's ironic is that this story format and this exploration invites the idea that there are multiple things happening, and yet we only want to use it to do one thing, which is to comfort ourselves and tell us that, like, in another universe, like, things are good, things are fine. I do it all the time. I'm like, in another scenario, I am still living in Florida. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting. Do not have that reaction as far as like finding it as a comforting thing. And I'm not saying you're wrong. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's not familiar as like, that's not how I would react to it. But that's an interesting thought because there's also that weird connection where the novel that they're discussing is his ancestors' novel, that his
Right.
family has had this problem, like, we could never figure it out. We're kind of embarrassed by it.
Yeah.
And then this guy's like, no, I figured it out. And then he's like, oh man, it sucks. I have to kill you. Not
Right.
only, so like just being able to sit with him for a while is like a nice moment
Yeah.
for him. Like to have him lay it all out for him to discuss it. And then he's like, well, now I got to kill you because I got to send that message to the Germans.
Right. He's like, oh, yeah, show me that letter. Actually, I gotta go.
And he thinks he's being pursued. So he thinks there's a time limit on these things. He
Yes.
waits until he believes Madden is running across the entryway there. He's like,
Right.
well, now's the time. But yeah, he does find a kind of like a respite in that moment.
Right. Because, like you said, like he approaches this house thinking, like, all right, here's the Albert. And, like you said, he hears this music and he goes, wait a second. And then the guy answers the door and he's talking his language. And then he mentions this garden. And he's like, hold on, what? Like, this was supposed to be a rush job. And instead,
Yeah.
he got some kind of like consolation prize. I don't know if this is like my takeaway or not, but I found myself realizing that there were, like, for me, a couple twists and turns packed into the very end there. The fact that he kills him. Why is he doing that? Like, because we don't really
Yeah.
know, like, I didn't know what he was planning to do when he went to this house except like escape, or I don't know. I didn't know that like he was going to send a message with this killing.
Yeah, that's an interesting twist because you forget
Yeah.
about that because of the whole
Right.
garden path, the forking path thing. But that's how, like, the setup in the beginning is I gotta send a message. And then you're like, all right, now he's in this conversation. And all of a sudden at the end, he kills him. You're like, what is happening? Why is he doing? And then, oh, that's the message. Okay.
Well, because we're never in on like what the message is or how he plans on doing it. He just, like, we talk about this a lot. I think like recently I think I've talked to you like on the side about like things I'm encountering in workshops where, especially if something is first person, you're gonna at least have a dissatisfied reader by the end if we're not in on some of the things that the writer knows, the narrator knows. It is in some ways just bad storytelling. And in other ways it is just like massively disappointing, and it feels like a cop out, and it feels like a trick, and it feels cheap almost. I read a lot of novels like this too, believe it or not, and it's like a hate read thing where I'm reading it and I don't know why I'm still reading it. There's something engaging about not knowing what's going to happen, and then there's something like extremely aggravating about knowing that there are things that I should know being told this story, and it's beyond unreliable narrator territory. It's not, let me tell you about
Yeah.
my life, I'm a drug addict and I'm not going to tell you the full story, or I'm a little bit of a liar. This is like he knows what he's doing and he purposely doesn't tell us for the enjoyment of the reader, and that is a meta thing.
A very common version of this I've seen at so many different places. It comes up as a TV, it's like in TV or movies a lot, but it'll be something along the lines of, all right, let's go, the characters get together and say, let's discuss the plan. All right, does everybody understand the plan? It's obvious that they know what the plan is, but we cut away and we never tell the reader what the plan is, right?
Yeah.
Or another version of that is it could just cut there and we never hear them discuss the plan. Or another version is like from inside, if it's a single character, they'll think to themselves, all right, I know what's going to happen next, but then we're not told that. We don't get to see the thought process of them thinking through the plan. It's
Right.
something happens, like they deliberately eschew thinking of it. They're like, I'm not going to think about that. Or it cuts away, or they say, they'll be vague about it, right? So
Hmm.
I've seen that so many times. And every time I do when I'm reading, I'm like, okay, this is the thing. The writer didn't know how to do this. The writer didn't know how to tell me what's happening without giving away his story or her story. Like you said, it always feels cheap. There was never a moment like that in here, I don't feel
No.
like.
Yeah, and that's what I'm getting at. It somehow this works, even with these packed twists at the end. I didn't feel cheated, and maybe this is what it is. Maybe it's the key is that he is as taken aback, willingly entering this house and having this conversation and finding out who this man is. That like by the end, this twist for us is the only comparable twist for him. If we knew that he was going to this house to kill this man, and then we found out alongside him that this was like, oh my gosh, look who this guy is, we wouldn't have appreciated the ultimate ending where he inevitably had to kill him. He was going to do that from the start, and he does it. And maybe the only way to for us to understand like what a bizarre twist that was for him would be to say, and then I killed him, because unfortunately that was the scenario and the version of life that we were in right now. That was the timeline. It didn't feel cheap, and I don't know how I pulled it off.
I mean, at the very beginning of the story, he says, I need to get a message out about the target. I got to figure out a way. Oh, and this guy, Madden, is killing all the other spies. So I'm on a deadline. I
Yes.
have to do this immediately. So he runs out. And he's like, how am I going to do this? Oh, I'll find someone with the same name as the city they need to bomb or where the target is. And that's how I'll get the message out. So I should look up the exact way it's presented. But in a certain way, we're being given everything we need
Yes.
to go forward into the story. Like we know what he's doing. He wants to get a message out. He needs to find the person, but we don't know more than that. But that gives us so much that it drives us through the story. And so by the end, we're distracted by this other thing that comes up just the same way he is. But he doesn't forget he has to send the message. So he turns around and says, now I got to do the thing I came here to do. And that's when we learn how the message goes out. So I think part of it is just being given enough to understand motivation. Like, because what is the driving force of most stories is the character wanting to do something. And as long as you know what they're doing and why they're doing it, you're into it. The moment that you draw back and you're like, I don't know why they're doing this. So that's why those moments in those stories that say, I'm not going to think about the plan, or let's cut away and not explain the plan. What they're doing is they're removing our understanding of motive, our understanding of why these actions are taking place. And that's why that feels a little like, I don't know about this.
Yeah, you're right. Like we know enough. And what other version of an ending would this be if not like a little bit of a this is how it comes together moment? It's not like a massive like secret that he's kept from us. It's just here's the end and now you know it too. It's almost like this whole like forking path story in this scenario was a detour, or else he
Yeah,
would have
yeah.
told us the point much sooner. He was as distracted by this, or else he would have been like, I had to tell him this. Unfortunately, it was just an Albert.
I mean, if that Chinese music wasn't playing, would have he just pulled the trigger when he opened the door?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's how it would have gone. And then, like, he would have slinked away into the night and felt like maybe he was being pursued for the rest of it. Wouldn't have even gotten to hang out there long enough to see Madden, like, cross the lawn.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I like bracketed off like the last like three paragraphs on the last page. I was like, whoa, a lot is going on here for me. Basically, like sets him up to get shot and then tells us why he did it. And then I think even comes around a third time by saying, like, in the sentence that I read, that he felt god awful about it. Like, everybody gets to know all of these things and they know my plan and they understood how to avoid like disaster here, but like no one understands like how guilty I felt about having to do it this way. And I thought too that a lot of this story almost felt like telling instead of showing. It's almost entirely dialogue where we are being told and explained how this Garden of Forking Paths works. It's almost all backstory, and even that works. You could argue it's an info dump of sorts. I mostly hate stories that work this way, where it's like, here's this exciting plot. I'm literally being pursued and like running for my life in a wartime scenario. I am a spy. Wow, how exciting. Let's take this detour and be told a backstory from how freaking long ago in this like stranger's living room. I'm thinking about running for my own life and being sat down and told a saga. It's like, get to the point, brother. And it still works.
It's interesting how that's brought up. So the way that the whole Garden of the Forking Paths even is brought up is somebody tells him to go, like, how do I get to this address? And they say you have to just keep taking left turns. Everywhere he goes, keep taking a left turn. And as he's going, he's like, that's the same advice you give to like get through a maze, right? Which makes me think about back on my ancestor who was trying to create a maze. And then he's just running through his mind, like what that story was. Oh, yeah, that maze. That was my ancestor doing this. It's like the story is putting us in a mind of mazes, right?
Yes.
Like, let's start thinking about mazes. So we think about it briefly there, and it comes up in different ways. And then when we get to the conversation about it, then we're primed. We're ready to sit down and listen to this guy, like, talk about it. And I think a lot of like info dumping comes off, like, if you want to call it info dumping, I don't know that it is because it's not in the narrator's voice. It's not in like a like step back, omniscient kind of like distant voice. It's in
Yeah,
dialogue, and dialogue always does it much better than
it does. Yeah.
narrator.
But so it's also not Maiden Butler because he doesn't know it.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
has to be told this. Yes. Anyway.
Because we've been introduced to it as a mystery. It's a family mystery. We already know about it by the time we get there. So like as he's discovering the answer to the mystery, we're also discovering the answer to the mystery. And that helps too. Yeah, those are like little techniques, little tricks, those ways of getting information to the reader, ways of making it still interesting, even though you're like, all right, here's your medicine so you can understand my story. How do you
Right.
make the medicine taste good? Those are ways to do it.
And there's probably like, I mean, you said this, but on a very basic level, as advice for like a writer, you can get away with something like this if it's a good enough story.
Oh yeah.
If this wasn't a story about like infinite timelines and scenarios in the universe and a maze that your ancestor built and no one understood, I wouldn't really want to hear about like your grandma's like favorite recipe that she never shared with anyone, right? Like that would be like a very frustrating detour in this story that just didn't pay off. Like if it's of a certain caliber and it demands this level of attention and explanation, if it's this big an understanding and reveal, you can pull it off. But like I said at the beginning, like this is a writer that is known for like these sort of like grandiose undertakings
Yeah.
that maybe only he can pull off because he's conceived of them, but they're sort of lofty.
I don't know if you look in his notebooks and you read the early version of the story. It's a spy thriller, but in the middle, like you said, he discovers that what the recipe's missing is like walnuts. I think it was, and that's the revelation. And then he shoots the guy.
He's like, I knew it.
Yeah, it would be a very different tale. I mean, it helps that it's, like you said, a spy thriller.
Yeah, it helps that there is a plot, an immediate plot that is exciting enough, right? Like we're off to the races. And so whatever comes next is kind of like, you've already earned my attention somehow. I guess I'll stick with it. Yeah, I'm trying to think like what my takeaway is. There's something about this story that does not fit most of what it is I would tell you I'm interested in personally when I read things.
Yeah.
Like I'm not like into like war stories or spy thrillers or like stories that like you said it's not backstory but it's like or maybe it's backstory it's not backstory and it's not info dumping, it's something different where it's like I have to sit down and tell you this. That's the only way this unfolds is a long conversation where someone explains things to our narrator. I'm not
Yeah.
even like a huge fan of stories like that or even movies, like at the end of a film where someone's like, all right, let me explain the Matrix. It's like I wanted to like discover it along, there's always something more exciting when you get to like discover it in real time. So there's nothing about this that I would tell you that I like, and yet it gets pulled off. And I think it's probably because it's exploring one of these very lofty concepts of alternate realities and timelines that I'm probably personally interested in. And like I said, my take on it being that at least in most situations where I've encountered it, it's like a source of comfort. I think some people think that science fiction, because that's kind of how I would read some of these themes here, is like for people without religion, and people with religion look at people without religion and think like, what a scary, unmoored way to live, And people who are like really like introspective would say that like religion gives people meaning and understanding of their world. And then to like have all of that flipped on its head and be told like, oh, actually like in one scenario this happens and in another scenario things are worse off. It's not supposed to be comforting for a lot of people, but I think for some people it is. And I think that's how I felt when I read this. And I just like that take. I think sci-fi is sometimes like really like a scary genre. It invites like questions of things that we think might come to pass because they're things that we worry about. And in this one, I was like, huh, it's not so bad.
One thing to think about in those terms is that I think this story, I think it informed the multiple worlds interpretation of quantum physics. And I think that's like been its influence. It's like any story that you now think of, like the Spider-Man multiverse stories and stuff like that, or that are very recent, any story that has multiple timelines comes from this. Like there was no multiple timelines, alternate worlds, alternate possibilities possibilities before
Yeah.
this story ever happened. And so every story that does that now is remixing this in some way. So this being the very first one is not going to do a lot of the crazy stuff that people have done. You could read this story and think, oh, it would have been interesting if something like the forking paths, like if he'd glimpsed himself scurrying down another alleyway and like four versions of himself came to a head in some other place. Or, like there's things you could do with that, right? But this was the first one that presented the idea ever. So it wasn't even in the consciousness of society at the time, right? Or of the culture. So I think part of the presentation needs to be like this so that we can come to understand it. And the fact that he was able to put it in such a clear way is
Right.
just phenomenal.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is very clear. It's not, like you said, if this is the first time we're being introduced to this concept, then experiencing it alongside a narrator might not work. Maybe it needs to be told this way in this like hand-holding situation where somebody sits down and it's a long, drawn-out dialogue.
Yeah, there's a project I'm working on now where it's like a fantasy story where it's just a different world. The metaphysics are just different. So I have to figure out a way to present that to the reader. I can't rely on shorthand. There's got to be like
Yeah.
some way to like make that clear. And like this kind of presentation probably is a good way to do that. Like have somebody sit down and say, all right, like a conversation, like, or stories, telling a story about it. It's probably a good way to do it.
Yeah, I think we talk about this a little bit, like when it comes to fantasy and world building, how there's usually like a character that does some hand holding at the beginning by like explaining this is maybe not the way the world works, but how the adventure will begin and why.
Yeah.
And it's pretty effective because you're always learning it alongside the main character. Like it's a legitimate part of his paths, and so it helps you.
Yeah, that's probably like the only way to do info dumps in a helpful way is like is it's if it's a part of a character's growth to come to understand something, the reader gets to do that same growth alongside. And as long as you attach it to a character, the reader is on that journey with you.
Right. And as we're discussing this, I'm thinking of ways that I've seen this done extremely poorly in some workshop stuff where it's like
Yeah.
somebody has this like grandiose idea for like fantasy and sci-fi premises and like a massive cast of characters. And there's almost inevitably a conversation where somebody gets it and is trying to explain it to our main character who doesn't get it. And there's a lot of like, what do you mean? How does it like, oh my God, no, I don't get it. Like, there's almost like an argument going on. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
Like it almost always plays out in a way where like, you're like, let him just shut up and listen. Yeah.
that's an interesting point because the common refrain for writing engaging stories is it's got to be conflict. You got to base it in conflict. And so sometimes you think, okay, what's the conflict going to be in this explanatory dialogue? Like where
Yeah.
one character has explained something to another character, we'll make them argue about it. Like there's a conflict. Like he's going to disagree. Like that's not the only way to make it engaging. It's why it's not about conflict. It's about motive. It's like, what does this character want out of it? So if he wants the information, then he's going to coax the information out. He's going to like try to get it out. He's not going to argue about it. So yeah, it's just trying to figure out what the dynamics are of the conversation to make the reader really engage with it.
Yeah, and like sometimes it's a conflict because it is so much information to take in for that main character that they push against it or they're frustrated by it or overwhelmed
Yeah,
by it.
that can
And there's
happen.
something to be said for like the fact that this is done in a literal like living room in the evening and there's music playing in the background and it's kind of calm and like he's open to hearing it. He's completely intrigued and like on the hook and like listening. Obviously that's not going to work for every story, but maybe if you approach scenes like that where a main character has to stomach some harsh truths that we as the reader know are the whole point of this, right? We know we don't understand this, we need to hear it. Maybe the energy needs to be like one of curiosity, like you said, instead of like pure conflict. And that's how it kind of works.
Yeah, that works. I guess that's my takeaway is like thinking about this story, and it does this on so many different levels, is I've been thinking about the idea of like forward momentum in stories for a long time, and especially in the past few weeks for various reasons. But thinking about what drives a reader through a story, that I talked about in many episodes past about the river, you want your story to be a river that you fall into and it sweeps you along. Like what gives it that current? And in this story, we talked like the thriller aspect of it. Like it starts off in a classic kind of like character wants something, he tries to go get something. That's our profluence, that's our momentum. But then, like we talked about, it kind of spirals out, it kind of eddies around this conversation. But the character still wants something in that conversation. The character has attachment to the novel, questions about that novel from his ancestor. This person's offering answers to those questions. And so it's still wrapped up in those kind of motivations. And they're always shifting, but they're always pushing us forward. So it's brilliantly crafted. crafted in that way, that we're always being pushed forward, even though the motivations are always shifting. So it's a good story to like kind of, you could break down like probably page by page, like what is driving it forward on this page, what is driving it forward on this page. If you wanted to spend a couple hours like breaking that down and then learn from that. That's my takeaway.
No, that's a good point. Like you said, we're like off to the races with the premise, and even a scenario that might slow us down in another writer's hands is still pulling you along. Like at no point was I bored by this. And that, like you said, is probably a really good indication of the momentum.
I mean, that's all momentum is. It's like reader interest. Does the reader's interest flag at any point?
Well, I guess it means that gives momentum like it's almost like momentum's only achieved if like that's up to the reader. But I think in some cases, like a writer thinks that there's momentum because shit's happening, but I'm still not
Oh,
interested. Do you know what
yeah.
I mean? It's like it's momentum if you pull it off.
Well, yeah, like the writer might be interested in it, but the point is the writer needs to make the reader interested in it. And that's, you have to generate momentum in some way you have to figure out how to make the reader interested.
Yeah, that's a good way to think of it, though. Not just like to have things happening, but like, why do I care? Why do I
Yeah.
still care? Why do I care at this turn? Why do I care about the next page? Yeah.
And that we talk about stakes, we talk about character motive, we talk about goals. All that stuff is wrapped up in that.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.